Hi, everybody. This is Christian Lehman, and today we're going to continue our discussion of Emily Dickinson by looking at two really extraordinary poems. I heard a fly buzz when I died, and I felt a funeral in my brain. These are poems that many people know and recognize. I hope to suggest today that they're not doom and gloom poems. So even though Emily Dickinson is going to be using the words and language surrounding death and funeral customs, I want to suggest that instead the great creativity that she puts into these things is optimistic, full of life, and extremely, extremely invigorating. The other thing that we'll be looking at the end of this video is the idea of citation and why it's important and how you do it and what it is. So let's get started here with, I heard a fly buzz when I died. And before we get into it, and before I read it, let's just practice and review the concept of some basic words that we've been using, right? So let's start with, how many stanzas are there? How many stanzas? So remember, a stanza is a group of lines that are offset by an extra space, and a poet uses stanzas in order to separate meaning, often as kind of a way to, it's a new grammar, it's a different kind of grammar, a different type of syntax than the straightforward sentences that you might be used to. It's also a poetic difficulty. As you go on in your career of studying poetry, you'll realize that there's many different ways to construct a stanza. So lines per stanza, 4. And what's a 4-line stanza called? A quatrain, right? So that's just some of that basic information there. The other term that we were using is a near rhyme or a slant rhyme, and we will find that immediately in the first stanza. So I will read it, and then we will go through it line by line. I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. The eyes around had wrung them dry, and breaths were gathering firm. For that last onset, when the king be witnessed in the room, I willed my keepsakes signed away what portion of me be assignable. And then it was there interposed a fly with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and me. And then the windows failed. And then I could not see to see. So I wanted to read this with a little bit more energy than you might find other people doing it, again, to emphasize the lightness of the meter. Even though she's writing about this topic of the fly buzzing when she dies, there's life to it. And that life might be found in the fly, but it also might be found in the poem itself. So I heard a fly buzz when I died. The first thing that you probably are noticing there is the oddness of the verb tense, right? So verbs have 3 large tenses. There's 6 of them in English, but 3 that are important right now, past, present, and future. I died, I die, I will die. The others, if you want to know, are past continuous, I was dying, present continuous, I am dying, and future perfect, I will have died. And then you can add more to that. I will have been dying. So verbs are fun. So when I died, right? This is interesting because the speaker is dead. Right? The speaker is already dead. And then we have the stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air. So here, stillness, and that's repetition. Between the heaves of storm. So heaves is wordplay. Because what does heaves look like? That's right, it looks like heaven. So what is she describing? Well, she's saying, hey, the stillness is like in the eye of the hurricane almost, because there's this moment in a storm when the big gust blows and then it calms and then it blows again. So the heave is the big breath of the storm. And so it's almost like the stillness is maybe this place of transition. Another word for that is liminal, but that's not a term for us today. So what she's describing here is she's dying or is dead and is heading to heaven, maybe. This is a question. So already notice we have, and that interruption. I heard a fly buzz when I died, and now she's remembering that moment. So we kind of lose track of the fly for a little bit because in the second stanza, we shift to the eyes around had wrung them dry, and breaths were gathering firm. So let's stick with just those two lines because we have a new idea here, a new poetic term with the eyes and breaths. And this is synecdoche. Synecdoche. And I should have probably done this in a different color. But a synecdoche means part for the whole. So it's like if you compliment somebody's new car and you say, hey, nice wheels. What you mean is, I like your new automobile. So here, the breaths around had wrung them dry. This is the mourners, the people that are standing around the bed, weeping the death of the speaker. And breaths were gathering firm is the same. These breaths, like, they're separated, but they're standing in for the whole. And what it does is it kind of emphasizes these different ideas, right? So she said, I heard, and now we have eyes, and now we have breaths. So it's kind of like constructing humanity out of parts in a really interesting way. Had wrung them dry, right? If you wring something out, it means it was wet, and then you wring it out and it's dry. It means they've wept themselves clear. And then we get this idea of, for that last onset, for the last time something comes up to her, when the king be witnessed in the room. And so this largely, right, is this idea maybe of the King of Kings or of God coming and removing you. So that last onset might also be like the last breath. Maybe that last breath is also like a last thought, a last time you can witness. So notice witness is part of that language of cite that we are looking at. Stanza 3. I willed my keepsakes signed away what portion of me be assignable. And then it was there interposed a fly. So here we reintroduce the fly that we have kind of abandoned for almost 2 whole stanzas. And we can look at a little bit of diction here. So I willed my keepsakes signed away what portion of me be assignable. Right? The important word here is going to be willed, because when you will away your keepsakes, you are signing a will. You're giving them away. So this becomes an interesting question. What is the portion of yourself as assignable versus the question that is raised, which is what is not assignable? And that's what will transition us into the fourth and last stanza here, right? Because it seems to be like, oh, you can give away your possessions. That's fine, no problem. But there's some part of your human body or human self that's not. What isn't? Well, maybe I can suggest it's the soul or your spirit, however you want to define that. And so here we get the sense she's written out a will. And we have a really interesting word. We have interpose. To interpose means to get between something. To get between something. So we've already had some language of interposition. Right? If you'll remember, we had this idea of the betweenness, and now we have the interposed at the same time that that fly is coming back to us. So it's just interesting. And here we're going to learn what the fly gets in between, because the fly is in between several things. It's in between Emily's being alive, the speaker's being alive, and the speaker being dead. And it's also interposed physically between the speaker on the bed and the window. Right? So if you want to imagine this, we'll do that in a second. With blue uncertain stumbling buzz between the light and me, and then the windows failed, and then I could not see to see. And so here is our kind of return to the between. So if we just want to sketch this quickly, it might make things a little bit clearer. So you can imagine a room, and in that room, there is a window. It's going to be the sun to tell us it's a window here. We'll draw a happy tree. And then there's a bed. We'll put the speaker there. And all around the speaker are very sad people. Here's some sad people. And they're crying. And then there is, in between the speaker and that window, a charming, darling little fly. That's our fly, all right? And so with blue, why blue? Because maybe blue light is shining in, but also if you look really close at flies, sometimes they have a blue tint, especially like a blue fly. uncertain stumbling buzz. So the stumbling buzz is really interesting because it seems to be maybe it's pushing itself against the window. And then the windows failed. So what does it mean if a window fails? Well, what I want to suggest is, so window can have several meanings, right? Window to the soul. So it could be life. It could be things turning dark. A window fails if it doesn't let light in, and so it turns dark. A window can also fail, though, when it doesn't keep things out or keep things in. So I suggest that the window failing is the fly escaping. And at that moment, right, blind, dark, we can think about what that means. So in that last stanza, a fly appears between her bed and window. So we have a really interesting question that we can end with on this poem, and that's an interpretation question. When this fly appears, is it taking her soul? Is it her soul, or is the fly her reincarnation? Right? So there's a lot of different ways to think about this. And then we can also think about, what does it mean to say, I could not see to see? Is that the moment that she's dead? Or is this? Like, what's the time frame here? There's this is a rich poem, and it's really exciting to think through because there's not right answers. And so this is one of the ways in which, even though the topic is death, the topic is not death. Only a fool would sit here and look at this poem and say, oh, it's depressing, it's sad, it's all about death and doom and gloom. No, it's not. It's full of life. It's full of questions. It's full of curiosity. It's full of a blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz of our own minds. Moving on to I Felt a Funeral in My Brain. Looking at it, we see 5 stanzas, 4 lines each, and a 4-line stanza. That's right, quatrain. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service, like a drum, kept beating, till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll, as all the heavens were a bell and being but an ear, and I, in silence, some strange race, wrecked, solitary here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down, and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing. Then, all right, so great. We're going to move a little bit briskly through this. I still want to point out a few things, but we'll see what we come to. So immediately we can start with this first line. I felt a funeral in my brain. You'll notice in there we have alliteration with F. We have F alliteration. So what does F alliteration do for us? Well, it emphasizes the idea that the funeral is a feeling. So is this a real funeral? No, this is not a real funeral. We have our metaphor. The exciting thing about this metaphor is she's not going to explain it fully to us, leaving it open for interpretation. And mourners, to and fro, kept treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. So these mourners are going to be super important for us. We'll give them a nice yellow circle. Because what's going on here? Well, she seems to have something treading, and a tread is like a heavy step. We have repetition. And you can kind of imagine this, like bum, 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 bum. So what then are the mourners? This is an exciting question and one that I hope you want to think about on your own, but a couple quick ideas are, it could be the thoughts, it could be anxiety, it could just be a headache, a thumping in a headache, it could be something else. Till it seemed that sense was breaking through. So Emily's, in this poem, just like in the previous one, we kind of had these different stages through the stanzas as it was telling the story. Here too, we're going to work on this metaphor of the funeral. And so in this one, the mourners are arriving at the funeral. And when they all were seated, a service, like a drum, kept beating, till I thought my mind was going numb. So here we have they. So what does they refer to? Who is they? What is the antecedent of they? The mourners. So it's saying the mourners, all that treading, that is settled down. But as soon as that settles down, this other thing kicks into gear. This other thing keeps beating, which gives us more of that repetition that we were looking at. And we have a simile here. We have a simile with like a drum, right? Full of all this figurative language. My mind was going numb. So these two stanzas give us an interesting way to kind of remind ourselves of the idea of slant rhyme, which we didn't talk about in the previous poem because I forgot to do it. But we might point to something like fro and through, slant rhyme, but drum and numb are perfect rhymes. So here we're starting the service of the funeral and we're transferring the source of the repetition, that obnoxious kind of thumping. Stanza 3. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul. With those same boots of lead again, then space began to toll. So really fascinating issue here is the diction of the word box. So box is a very kind of normal word, because she has options, right? You could say casket, you could say coffin, and the difference between those is generally shape, but they also have different sounds. Emily's picked box, so you can say a lot about like that word. You can offer an entire interpretation around why box. I heard them lift the box. The them is again going to be our mourners. So keep referring back to these mourners, whoever, whatever they are, and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. So really interesting use here of same, the adjective same, and the adverb again, because that's telling us it's more of this idea of repetition happening over and over, right? And the boots of lead, that refers back to our tread, because we're walking back and forth. And so in this one, it seems to be after the funeral, after the service, and so folks are lifting the casket. We now get an interesting construction of a simile. As all the heavens were a bell. It's going to be a simile. What we would say is as if all the heavens were a bell. So the entire space, and now it's overwhelmingly loud. And you get this thunderous bong, bong, bong. So we started with the treading, tread. And then we had the beating, beat. And then we had the boots of lead. And now we have this toll. And being, right? My existence is nothing but an ear. It's like I'm all one big ear being accosted by all of this sound. Also a form of synecdoche from our previous language. And I, wrecked in silence, some strange race, and I in silence, some strange race, wrecked solitary here. This is a really important line, I think, with silence and I are in this strange race, right? We have all this sound, and then we have silence, and we have the person. And it seems to be the sense of like the race is life, and that silence, it might be peace, but maybe that silence is death. Maybe this is a state of being to have all of these like external and internal accostings on the brain. But with all of this, what we have intensification. What we have here is a really great intensification. Actually, I'm going to write this now and then explain it. We have anaphora, which you'll see with all of these ands that start the line. So remember, anaphora is successive lines beginning with the same word or phrase. And so here we have and when, and then, and now look at this last stanza, just boom. Pure anaphoric intensification. Everything is happening and accumulating. And she's been battling against all of this sound coming in. And then a plank in reason broke. So Interesting language like with planks, because one of the things that you make boxes out of are planks. But also it seems to be like, like walking the plank might come to mind as well. But it snaps, right? It breaks. And with that breakdown, we might think about all of those other things that have happened, right? We had the beating that happened earlier, leading to this idea of the brokenness. We have the tolling, all of these things, and we get broke. And I dropped, and this is where we might think about that language of the pirate ship, walking the plank, plunging down, down and down, and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. So, I've neglected to say in the previous one, we kind of have the moving of the casket as the bell starts rolling, and now we have putting the casket in the ground, maybe with this idea of I dropped down, and that depends on if you want to think about it. Of what's going on here. So this idea of hitting a world at underworld and underworld and underworld. But notice we have this really, really exceptional dash at the end because it's an interruption into silence. It's an interruption into silence. It doesn't end with a period or an exclamation mark. It's just a dash, and we're forced to finish knowing at the same time that she is. And so again, it's this idea of control in this moment of madness, right? A poem is very hard to construct, especially one with a developed metaphysical metaphor operating at this intense length. And so this sense of control at the same time, what that control of form is doing is representing this kind of like loss of control, this kind of break in reason. You can't think straight, like the idea of a plank being straight, it breaks. You can't think straight. So it's up to a lot. I don't want to control too many of your interpretations here, but I do want to talk about like that extended metaphor. I think there's another really huge potential for this poem to maybe not be describing internal suffering with like thoughts and anxiety and headaches, but perhaps it could also be expressing a really intense like pleasure that's happening, where kind of abstracting it along this line of the orgasm being a little death, to use the French for that, le petit mort. And there's all of these different, a history of thinking about like, orgasm and sexual pleasure next to death. And so I want to add this to suggest, Emily Dickinson might be up to something a lot more sly than it appears on the page. So let's talk briefly in conclusion about the idea of citation. Poetic citation is an act of generosity to someone else. It's your way of saying, hey, you don't believe me when I say that this poem is doing this thing? Check. That citation becomes your evidence. And to use that evidence with poems, we use line numbers. With plays, we use what are called the act number and scene number. And then with books, we use page numbers, right? That way you can say to somebody, oh, it's on page 62, and they run and see it. With this, you could say, oh, it's in line 4. So let's think about, I heard a fly buzz when I died. Emily Dickinson, and there's a couple different ways of doing this, right? Like Emily Dickinson's use of willed in line 9 of fly buzz suggests, or Emily Dickinson's use of willed, line 9 in parentheses, suggests, right after the quotation, or Emily's use of willed suggests, and then you write out what you think it means, and then at the end of the sentence, you write line 9. You'll notice a couple key things here. Your quotation marks surround your quote, and that quote can then be found when you tell me, all right? So that's how that works. Great work. We'll be looking at a few more poems, and then we'll move on to our next author. Thank you very much for your time today.